I'm just firing up the gas stove to cook my porridge. Like nearly half the households around the country, we're connected to natural gas. We cook with it, it heats our water and our house. But the country is running out of gas, or so we're told. So what do we do if the flame goes out? I'm Sharon Brett Kelly, and today on The Detail, why gas customers are being hit with a double whammy. But first, let's hear from Newsroom's Mark Dulder about what's going on with our gas supplies and any possible replacements.
We're not likely to run out in the very near future. You might be thinking 27% now, you only take a few more years of that kind of drop and you're totally gone. But the reality is we have quite robust onshore reserves that give you a certain baseline of gas for quite a while. It's more the offshore fields that are seeing quite significant declines. And there are a couple of reasons for those declines. One of them is that we're using the gas that is in those fields. And so once you produce it and you burn it, you obviously can't go and get it again. And then the other reason is that we're finding that there's actually less there than we had thought or hoped there had been.
Some new figures, speaking of numbers, to remind us what sort of trouble we have around some of our natural resources. Last year there were 12.5% less production of natural gas than forecast. In the first 3 months of this year it's even worse, it's down 27.8%. This means industrial users will need to reduce their use, and schools and hospitals may face bigger prices, of course, and shorter term contracts.
The main contributors there are, it turns out there are fewer reserves than we thought there were. It's always a bit of a guessing game about how much is down there. And then also our annual usage drags down on what's left as well.
The figure is that by the end of this year, annual gas production will fall below 100 petajoules. What even is that? Can you put it in context in terms of what would a household use?
A household uses much less than that. Part of the difficulty is that you get different units for the big gas market, which is in petajoules, versus household usage, which is in kilowatt hours. But one way of looking at it is that all of New Zealand's households that use gas collectively together, they use about 7 petajoules, or they did last year in 2024. That usage isn't the kind of usage that's really being imperiled by these declines in gas availability. It's more the big industrials and the electricity generators that rely on gas. So if you look again at that data from last year in terms of, where the gas actually was used, in total there was about 120 petajoules of gas that was produced and therefore used. And of that, you had 43 petajoules used for electricity and energy transformation. You had about 20 for, quote, non-energy use, and that's things like producing ammonia and methanol, where the gas is a feedstock or an ingredient in producing that rather than burning it for its energy. Then you had food processing, so thinking, some of the gas-fired boilers that Fonterra uses and others. Was about 20 petajoules. You had 13 petajoules for chemicals. A lot of that is those industrial type processes. 7 petajoules for commercial, your restaurants and things cooking with gas, and then 7 for residential. So it's the gas that we use in our very, very day-to-day life is not a significant proportion of all the gas that goes into the system in New Zealand.
And that's the thing really, isn't it, Mark? We have been getting a lot more stories about gas. And, we found out last year when we had the great energy crunch that one of the key reasons we were in this situation was because there was no gas.
Yeah, one of the difficulties with gas, right, is that in theory, it's quite a reliable source of energy. It's not like the wind or the sun where clouds can come in or the wind can drop out. But on the other hand, that reliance is based on estimates of how much gas is in a field, and these fields can be quite volatile things. Sometimes they have unexpected outages. We know in 2018, the Pohokura gas field endured a really long unexpected outage that produced a similar kind of problem for the energy market and the electricity market as happened last year.
The thing that I find confusing, though, is that just in this last budget, the government announced $200 million over 4 years for co-investment in new domestic gas field developments.
Our government has set aside a contingency of $200 million to overcome sovereign risk perceptions that have grown since a fateful decision of 2018. It signals a willingness for the Crown to take a commercial stake, 10 or 15% possibly, to turn around the declining fortunes in our energy sector.
We're hearing that these fields, they're volatile, you don't know really what you're going to get out of them, and that they had been winding down from the previous government, but now there's this new investment. So will that turn things around?
Yeah, there's a couple of different kinds of new exploration that you can do here, right? One of them is going out, trying to find a whole new source of gas and developing that field. And that's the thing that's currently banned by the 2018 ban on new oil and gas exploration. And it's the thing that government is planning to repeal that ban and enable that. That's not going to solve our problems anytime soon. The fastest we've ever had a conversion from finding gas to actually producing that gas is 10 years. And it's hard to say in 2035 we know exactly what our gas needs are going to look like. And reality is they're probably going to be a lot lower because we're going to be electrifying everything, and some of the industries that we've got that rely on gas are going to be electrifying or closing down. So putting aside that, going and finding new gas. The other bit is taking existing fields and seeing if we can find more gas around them. That's currently legal under the law, so you don't need to repeal that ban to do it. And it's something that's been going on, consistently and continually for many years, including since the ban was put into place. I think the figure is that about $1 billion has been spent trying to find extra gas in those existing fields. And there have been a few minor successes, but nothing major. However, there's a sense that there are a couple of fields, the Maui East field, the Totowai field, and also Todd Energy has a field that they've discovered 20 plus years ago, but have now applied for a permit to produce. And potentially this government co-investment could help make it a little bit more commercial for those producers to go and produce gas from those fields.
This government is rebuilding investor confidence, which in the gas and petroleum sector suffered a decline. And nowhere will we do it more rapidly than in the brilliant area of Taranaki, where my voice and ideas have been widely embraced. And then we will turn our attention to Te Waiponamu, South Island, where there's a huge gas field just waiting for investment.
Shane Jones would really like to have the government be able to completely revitalise the gas industry and send people out looking for brand new gas in brand new places. The reality is we haven't found any new gas in a brand new place for 2 decades or longer. We've only ever found gas in about 4 or 5 different places offshore anyways, so it's not like the Gulf of Mexico where there is all this gas sitting there. The resource probably isn't that strong, and $200 million isn't going to suddenly make it commercial to take that big of a gamble.
At the same time, are we looking at alternatives? We know that there's a lot of work going on with renewables and solar farms and that kind of thing, but actually gas alternatives. We're looking at things like liquid natural gas.
Yeah, liquefied natural gas, LNG. Basically, it's gas like we're used to, but you put it through a process to liquefy it, so it's a lot easier to transport because gas, as is, takes up a lot of space to transport. If you can liquefy it, you can move more easily. Last year, the industry started talking about potentially building an LNG import facility, and the government came out and said, hey, we'd support that. I reported last week for Newsroom that the initial feasibility studies of that have come back and they're looking not great. The cost of creating that facility would be really significant in upfront cost. Now the industry is looking to maybe smaller scale solutions like bringing them in on existing ships. The good thing about LNG, or the convenient thing, is that once you get it on shore, you can put it right into our existing gas transmission and distribution network. It's the same stuff as the gas we produce here. But there's some downsides that come with it. There are environmental ones, but also the cost of LNG is about 3 times higher than the cost of domestic gas. So if we suddenly link ourselves up to that global market, there's a concern that even our domestic producers might raise their prices quite a lot as well. No one can stop you.
Speaking of cost, gas customers get hit harder than people living in electricity-only houses. It turns out not once, but twice. So why are these numbers growing? The manager of Consumer NZ's Power Switch, Paul Fuge, says there are no specific figures from MB, but he's made his own calculations based on consumption numbers and says there's been an increase of 18,000 households on gas since 2019.
I wonder if it's when people are building new houses, developers, maybe putting in gas for various reasons. Perhaps it's cheaper to put in a gas connection rather than an electricity connection. I imagine that the gas calefons, the instant gas you see on the sides of houses, have two advantages probably in terms of a capital cost. They're probably cheaper to put in than a hot water cylinder, but also they take up a lot less space. So you can imagine when you're building a house as a developer, it'll be lower cost to put in gas. But what's happening there is you're kind of cursing those people who live in that house to high costs running that household.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it costs more to have gas and electricity. So an electricity-only house is much cheaper to run than a gas electricity house, because you can substitute all your gas appliances for electric appliances, but you can't substitute your electric appliances for gas appliances. Like you can't run a TV on gas or your lights on gas. So you have to have a gas connection, and you have to have an electricity connection as well if you've got gas. And what that means is you end up paying two sets of line charges. Now that's the cost of the infrastructure required to deliver that service to your house. You're having to pay for the gas network, the pipes to deliver the gas to your house, as well as the electricity lines to your house. So you end up with two sets of charges there.
Are people getting the right message, do you think? As you say, there's a whole gas industry out there. They're protecting their jobs, they're protecting their businesses. Maybe they're not giving customers the right information.
Well, I would agree with that. There's no national strategy for exiting from gas. I don't think we're going to run out of gas in terms of residential use. Residential gas use is only around 4% of the total, but it will get increasingly expensive, especially if you've got that infrastructure problems. Those pipes and wires are getting older, so the infrastructure costs are getting higher and higher. So you can see that gas will get increasingly more expensive, and what that can create is what we call a death spiral. People who can afford to get off gas will exit away from gas, those households, but the ones that are left behind end up with higher and higher costs. So those higher costs incentivize more people to get off. So you kind of get this spiral effect. And the people who are left on the gas network are probably the people who can least afford it, because those are the renters, the people who can't afford to buy the appliances to move away from gas. What's really needed is some sort of national strategy of how we exit this fuel supply in a managed way, in an equitable way, right? So that people aren't left behind.
How much are prices likely to rise, gas prices?
I mean, that's really hard to tell. I wouldn't want to speculate, but with electricity, you can see where they could build more power stations, more wind. The price of electricity generation is actually decreasing. The same can't be said for gas, because the gas is declining. So of course, that scarcity will push the price up, and will continue to do so unless we find a large gas reserve that we haven't discovered yet.
But here's where household gas customers are hit with the double whammy.
The thing with gas is it's becoming what we call a conditional product. And what I mean by that is there's very few retailers now, in fact there's only one left with two brands, that's Nova and Megatel, who will offer gas as a standalone product, reticulated gas we're talking about here. What that means is retailers will only supply you with gas if you take electricity from them as well. They won't supply it as a separate thing. So for most retailers now, if you want gas, you also have to take electricity from them. Now, what that means is that you're locked out of a lot of the cheaper electricity plans, right? So it's a double whammy. You have to take expensive gas and the gas daily charge, but also you don't get access to those cheaper electricity plans because the retailers that offer the cheaper electricity plans don't provide gas. And the other thing that's happening is they're phasing out the low fixed charge for electricity. So you may be aware that if you're a low electricity user, and gas consumers are low electricity users because they use gas, it means their electricity consumption is lower. And what was happening there was they were getting a lower daily charge for electricity because they had low consumption. Now that's being phased out. So what that means is people's electricity connections who are low users are getting more expensive every year for over 5 years. And that disadvantages gas customers because while they paid a gas connection fee, their electricity connection fee was reduced because of that. That will no longer apply.
So nearly half the country's households face surging gas bills, and a lot of people are trapped because they're renters or they can't afford to switch to electricity. We know the government supports liquefied natural gas, LNG, as an alternative, but like Mark Dalder says, it's not the ultimate replacement.
I don't think there's a sense that LNG can, on its own, return our gas usage to the levels it had been historically, which for a period in the 2010s, the kind of benchmark figure people use is around 200 petajoules a year. So, like you say, we're now expecting our domestic gas production to drop down to below 100 petajoules. There's not a sense that LNG would double that amount. It could help when you're facing a gas crunch like last year. Then maybe actually that higher priced LNG is lower than the market price of your domestic gas, and it can help maybe ease those prices in those tight circumstances. If you're an electricity generator, it might be quite convenient because you're not running all the time on gas, you only need it sometimes. And so being able to bring it in when you want it, as opposed to being, say, Methanex or some of these other industrial users of gas who actually they need it year-round, and the domestic supply is going to be a better option for them. But I don't think anyone's looking at LNG as a silver bullet for the energy system or even the gas system.
I noticed an Australian energy analyst last year actually warned against importing LNG. He said it uses about 10% of the energy that the gas would produce just to liquefy it.
There's a sense that from a climate perspective, in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, that LNG may be worse than coal, because you do have to do that process of liquefying it. You then have to ship it across the ocean and then transform it back into gas form, and then you burn it anyways, right? And so while gas on its own, in a vacuum, is much less emissions intensive than coal, although it is still a fossil fuel and one of the primary drivers of climate change, LNG may be, roughly on par with coal. And so from an environmental perspective, is it that much better to spend all this money to invest in importing LNG that we then burn and raising our gas prices in order to save emissions that actually you don't save if you just imported the coal and burned it at Huntly anyways?
So where does this all leave us, Mark? Because some of these big customers that depend heavily on gas, they must be worried.
Yeah, I mean, the big question is Methanex, right? So Methanex uses a very significant amount of the gas that we produce.
Methanex uses 40% of New Zealand's fossil fuel gas supplies, turning it into the petrochemical methanol for export. Its influence on the gas market is so strong that any report on gas, climate or energy tends to run two sets of projections based on whether Methanex stays or goes.
There have been a lot of studies that have suggested that if Methanex wasn't operating, we wouldn't have any significant gas supply problems.
It's a lot riding on a single Canadian-owned company operating plants from Santiago to Shanghai.
There was a concept consulting report that was produced for the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment under the last government, which the last government had a gas transition plan that it was working on, basically trying to figure out, what do we do here? There is declining amounts of gas available to us. How can we make sure that this is managed and not messy, avoiding the kind of thing that we saw last year with those mills closing? At the same time, the new government has cancelled that work, but this report suggested if Methanex closed, the remaining users and the remaining gas fields that we have without needing any new offshore exploration would be sufficient to transition us out to 2050.
Methanex wasn't ever expected to and certainly can't exist forever. So planning over time, I think, is going to be important.
That's one of the big questions. What happens with Methanex? A lot of the assumptions behind government policies, behind Climate Change Commission projections, and so on and so forth, is that at some stage Methanex will undergo a kind of staged closure of its facilities. And it's worth remembering, for Shane Jones in particular, that the reason we have Methanex here using all this gas is because a previous government in the 1970s and then 80s invested government money in creating gas fields, and by the time that they were up and running, it turned out we didn't need the gas anymore. So then they invested government money in creating these petrol and methanol plants to use the gas, and now we find ourselves 40 years later trying to invest government money to produce new gas to put into those facilities that we built because we had too much gas because we invested government money in producing gas, right? It's this horrible cycle that we undergo, and a bit, it's a classic think big kind of legacy that we've been left with.
And it was interesting, it came into the big news story last year during our energy crunch because
the Taranaki methanol plant is shutting until the end of October. It's going to sell its gas to Contact Energy and Genesis
at a very high price.
Basically, the cost of gas was so high that it was worth more to sell the gas off than to actually use it to produce their product, which is methanol. And that's kind of an example of why people are looking at Methanex and thinking there might not be a commercial future for you here if that's the situation that we're going to find ourselves in repeatedly, where your feedstock and your fuel is so expensive that it's you kind of just turn into a middleman company of buying gas and selling it onto the electricity market. Some of its facilities have already been closed down for quite some time, been mothballed for quite some time. Sometimes they open up and then they close back down again. But there's a sense that, certainly if you're working in Transpower or any of those agencies tasked with New Zealand's energy security and affordability, you'd be a lot happier not having Methanex sitting in the system using up all that gas and, exporting the profits overseas. And also, by the way, getting hundreds of millions of dollars in carbon subsidies over the past couple of decades. I think it amounts to $200,000 in carbon subsidy per employee at Methanex, in order to kind of keep those jobs local, which is quite something.
Back to the rest of the consumers and customers of gas, what's the ultimate replacement, or is there one? I'm wondering about biogas.
Biogas is something that there are active work programs to look at overseas and a little bit in New Zealand. It's being used in particular contexts. It is quite expensive, so you've got that similar difficulty as with LNG, where you go, is this what we want all of our gas to be? Maybe the prices will come down, but probably a better way of thinking about biogas is there are some things that we won't be able to electrify, and biogas is maybe the solution for those things, rather than saying, well, let's just keep burning something and we'll just burn biogas instead. There are a lot of other reasons to be electrifying things, whether you're a business, whether you've got a household with a gas cooker, or whether you're an industrial who would like to get off of the volatile gas reliance. But there are some things that technologically are just quite difficult to electrify, and for those situations, when you're looking out over the next few decades, biogas seems like quite a good option for keeping those industries running.
Where are we at with the National Energy Strategy?
It's a wonderful question. That was work that was begun under the previous government. The newer government has had maybe a more lackluster commitment to seeing it through, although it sounds like Minister Watts, the new energy minister, sees the value of taking the strategic approach. I don't get the sense that we're about to see it anytime soon, though. So, that could help answer a lot of these questions because, like we've talked about, there are a lot of these interdependencies in the network. Well, if Methanex is here, then that means this for the electricity sector, which means this for the gas consumers, which means this for the gas producers, et cetera, et cetera. And someone does need to come in and say, well, here's how we think things are going to go, because otherwise everyone's kind of moving blindly around. And it's not really a situation where the invisible hand of the free market on its own is best poised to solve this kind of strategic planning problem for us.
That is it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Phil Benj. Thanks to Mark Dalder and Paul Fuge. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Ka kite.